What's up YouTube? Today we have a very special video. We are making something super sick for a very good friend of mine. The lady, the myth, the legend, the overall ass kicker, Miss Tori Ramirez. We've been friends for quite a handful of years now. You've probably seen her on Instagram. So you'll see her racing horses. She'll put the audio on her Instagram to be like Limp Bizkit or like Corn or some crazy shit. Like, she's super rad. She is part of our tribe. Alternative edge in the Western world. With all that being said, we are making her something that is tailored just for her. This is gonna have all the flair you could ever want out of being an alternative person as well as being a Western person. Here is a little sneak peek of what we're gonna be making, so without further ado, let's jump into this bad boy. We start out by drawing everything in there. This video, we're gonna be talking about the tooling process a little bit more, so here's a little time lapse of the first chunk of this build. Alright, so this thing's gonna be pretty sick. I got my roses and my skulls all laid out, with the floral all in between. That was kind of hard to see. I could have penciled it in, but I'm not gonna fake it. This leather crafting, you want an anatomically correct skull, you gotta trace it. This thing's gonna be super sick. I'm gonna get it carved and get jumping on this. I'm actually super hyped for this. I tooled some of it so you guys can see like what it should look like and you can watch the progression. We're gonna tool this skull and these roses and continue our texturing process. So with this step, I use a lot less tools, just basically bevelers and backgrounders to kind of get some shading texture. You can see basically the subject matter or what we're going to tool is these three roses and the skull. If you look at the layout, this rose is on top and then it's the skull and then the other roses. So what I'm gonna do is start out by tooling these roses because we're gonna want this, this to appear as if it's on top of the skull. And whenever I tool roses, I always start from the center. We want to dig out these center portions so they have a little bit more pop to them. Because if you go backwards, you end up just kind of smashing everything down and it looking weird. So as you can see, as I'm tapping this, pushing all the stuff in the back, and then every time I hit a line, it brings that pedal that I'm working on in that moment back up. The rose is such a dramatic, kind of elegant flower that you want to do your best to replicate that character. As classy and classic and traditional as a rose can be, it can also be very, very tricky. And that I think is because just how iconic a rose is. Like roses are one of the very few flowers that translate, tons of art styles, tons of personal styles, tons of different cultures. So roses, if done wrong, can look really crappy, but if done right, it's what makes them so timeless. Now moving on to the skull, I tend to tool my skulls a little bit different. A lot of people like to just mold them, but I like to give it some good, really bold pop and depth. And how I do that is by tooling deep the important features of the skull. The eye sockets. I'm gonna give it some little linear texture here. As you can hear, I'm not really tapping some of these features as hard as others. Like that eye socket, I wanted super deep because, you want it to look really dramatic. And then we're gonna come back to the outline of the skull and to give it that real good pop. And the way I like to think about kind of doing these skulls is like the deeper you can go with the key features and the outline and the the outside of the skull basically is how deep you can go with the rest of it. If you go really deep around the outside, it gives you a lot of depth to work with and all the other layers of depth that we're gonna have. So what I'm gonna do for now
is leave the skull as it is, and when we come back to the finer tooling aspects of the roses and the skulls, then we're gonna give it more texture and whatnot. So for now, I'm going to tool these 2 roses. What I do for my roses, I take my thumbprint tool and I basically work from the center down, giving the petals texture. I'm not really trying to add extra depth on this, mainly this middle section. Very tricky to not bevel it too hard, but then when we start moving towards these outer petals, I'm holding this pear shading tool at an extreme angle. I'm like almost holding it at a 45. And what I'm really trying to do is basically kind of use it almost as a beveler. And then these lines and the textures that it's leaving is almost like the bonus. So what I'm doing is I'm bringing more of the whole petal itself down. Since I have this tool in my hand, I'm just gonna do the rest of these roses, and then we'll finish off on the skull. And that's how I tool my roses and give them texture. Skulls are a love-hate relationship because they are very tricky. They're just so iconic, and you've seen a million artist renditions of them. So when you mess up on a skull or a rose, it's just a nightmare because you've seen 1,500 of them. So what I do here on the line of the teeth is I double bevel them, and then I come back and line up this beveler with where the teeth are to give that like tooth separation. We're gonna come back with other textures. Now it's gonna be the time to remove the background here in this jawbone to give us that crazy depth that we're looking for. And then when we come into these sockets, we're gonna come at a really extreme angle. We're going for that depth here. So when we go to stain that, that's gonna be really dark, and then it'll fade nicely into these line textures that I had going earlier. Now I'm gonna come back in with my pear shader tool and do the same, basically the same concept as these petals. I'm gonna come back with this pear shader or this thumbprint tool and basically use it as a beveler, which is gonna give us a really dramatic sense of depth. And then the thumbprint tool is what does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to these skulls. Basically, you can see I'm writing it right here on the line, the bottom line of the jaw. I hate having to flip my pieces around, especially belts. They're super annoying. But I'm gonna come in here and ride this line, which is going to give the skull a nice highlight when we go to stain it. This high part is going to just really make this whole thing pop. But there we have it. We have Tori's brand here down at the end with the rose coming out of the tip, skull. I like to use you can see I set my holes to know where the holes are gonna go. I like to use this little end piece. It's a perfect little chunk of the belt that's like completely isolated over off here on its own. It's just a perfect little piece with the brand, the skull, the roses, a little bit of floral, just to kind of give you an idea of like what the whole belt is. And then during this whole section, I don't like to go too crazy with the custom tooling because, you know, buckle is gonna go over the top and the hole is just messy if you have too much going on here. And especially if you're trying to like portray a certain idea or a certain message or something important, I never tool it along the stretch where the holes are. That's why I gave it, you know, a couple roses in here and just kind of filled it in with floral. And then everything else is, you know, those bold roses with skulls throughout the whole thing. Different positions of skulls, different roses. You know, something that's pretty out of the box with the skulls and the roses, but also still pretty traditional. So I wanted to like concentrate the skull and rose chunks and then still give these nice stretches of just traditional floral tooling. You know, I have the rose situation here, and then this is gonna kind of cut through, so when everything gets stained, it's gonna have just like a nice little window of still reminding you that this is still a custom tooled, you know, Western style belt. I'm gonna let this dry for a few, and then I'm gonna throw some stain on it and some paint and wrap this puppy up.
This thing is so sick. We got our brand down at the end. Infinite levels of just sickness, I swear. Honestly, this might be my favorite belt I've ever made. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that it's the most technical belt I've ever made. I've definitely been able to show some of my tricks and like abilities in my bag more, but like when it comes to the stuff that I like as an artist and my art style, like this belt could not, literally could not have like fit it any better. I'm not gonna lie, making that belt was incredibly fun. I love doing skulls. Roses are my favorite flower to tool, and just, I mean, that thing is just punchy as hell. So I'm really excited to put this bad boy in my portfolio. It's gonna definitely be somewhere up there in the front for sure. Leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that obligatory YouTube shit. Tell a friend. All that stuff goes a long way. I will catch you guys in the next one.